So I am Maria Alvarado. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm with Paul EDU. I'm going to keep it brief, and I talk very fast, so I'm sorry that I'll be very fast. So Paul EDU was on the T-shirt, so we did sponsor the event. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here yesterday because I had a prior commitment, but we are here today. And what are we? So we are an education program that helps rehabilitate animal cruelty offenders. And of course, most people think of animal cruelty offenders with the intent of harm. However, our program is geared more towards those cases that are neglect. And of course, we educate the individuals about the humane treatment of animals, and we are current in use with Bexar County District Court. So their clients who go to probation take our course as a portion of their process. And we do reduce recidivism, which the rates, of course, will be published probably a couple years from now. We do have a pilot study going on over the course, so we will also know the effectiveness of the course as we get real-time data as well. The way it works is that right now it's available online. It is in English and Spanish, so you'll be able to use it in your animal cruelty process should you be able to take this home today. So the participants can take it in the privacy of their home. It does have 14 lessons, and then the lessons are followed by the exam. Then that exam issues a certificate of completion, which then goes back to either the probation officer, animal care services, or wherever it best fits in your animal cruelty process. And of course, how it helps, we educate people and we teach them how to be better pet owners. As I mentioned, most of these cases are baseline neglect, so it's not the intent of harm, which happens at a much larger rate than the really bad animal cruelty cases. And as we know, animal cruelty is strongly correlated with other crimes. So unfortunately, people who are not nice towards pets can also not be kind towards people. And that link between those two, of course, is what we want to address as well. So you will find us at the Bexar County, not just in their animal court, but in the family violence court as well. There is a $25 course fee, and it's designated to local charities, so this is probably one of the larger social enterprises for any animal welfare program. All right, and how can you help? Of course, you can go to your local DA, judge, probation officers, animal care services, whoever's involved in the animal cruelty process locally, and then have it mandated. So we just want to make sure that we are able to be in as many cities as possible and get as many people educated as possible. Right, any questions? Any questions?
You said it's in Bexar County only now, or is it online for other
It's online for anybody to use, so I do have brochures that you guys could take home with you if you want to implement it in your area. So the course is not made for just Bexar County. The lessons touch base across general topics, so it can be used wherever you fit. So if your animal cruelty process go through animal care services, well then animal care services is the one who enforces it. We are working to get into the municipal level as well, but that takes a little while longer because of the city council. So the Bexar County District Judge just picked it up and went with it because she was able to, but yeah, we are working on municipal level offenses next. Any other questions? Very good questions. All right, well, I won't take too much of the speaker's time. Thank you so very much.
Okay, just wanted to thank you all for coming this evening to Lifesaving Animal Control Policies. As Mary mentioned, I'm Leanne Shenenfeld, I'm the Deputy Chief Animal Services Officer for the City of Austin, Texas. I oversee all of the center's externally focused programs, which includes our Field Services Unit, which is comprised of animal protection, and our outreach team, as well as our volunteer program. Prior to coming to Austin, I was the Assistant Director of the Fairfax County Animal Shelter outside Washington, D.C., where I, among other responsibilities, directed our adoptions and intake programs. And in the decade prior to that, I worked for the Fairfax County Park Authority, where I learned a lesson that has been absolutely vital to this animal welfare journey, which was that no matter whether I ran programs and facilities as diverse as waterfront operations at a lakefront park, a membership program at the highest grossing recreation center in the county, or whether I managed visitor services for an 18th century historic site, the only way we were able to successfully achieve our mission was to actively seek ways to be part of the community. My co-presenter today is April Moore. As she mentioned, she is the newly promoted engagement manager. She's worked in animal welfare in Austin for over 13 years. She began as an animal protection officer and led the animal protection unit for a decade before being recently promoted to her new position. We'll spend about 40 minutes today talking about how Austin Animal Center's animal protection team evolved from a traditional enforcement-based animal control program to one that actively engages the community and solutions and supports Austin's life-saving initiatives. But what I'm really hoping you'll take away today, regardless of whether or not you all are animal control officers or whether you work for an organization that has animal control responsibilities, is that it isn't enough for shelters themselves to be no-kill. We have to create no-kill communities, which we do by revitalizing, promoting, and protecting the human-animal bond and approaching our community as partners. And regardless of our role in animal welfare, we can find ways to do that. Because today we're going to talk about some very specific ways that Austin Animal Center's animal protection team did that, which you may or may not be able to do yourselves in your own organization. To put our program into a little bit of context, Austin's Field Services Unit services a jurisdiction of over 1,000 square miles. It includes 2 different jurisdictions. We service the city of Austin, as well as the unincorporated areas of Travis County. So it can be a 40-mile trip to the shelter for some folks. With over 1.12 million people calling Austin and Travis County home, it's the 5th most populous county and has seen rapid growth and footprint expansion, almost 15% in 5 years. People of Austin live in urban, suburban, and rural neighborhoods, so on a given day we see a variety of animal control concerns. We may be responding to complaints about stray dogs or stray livestock even. We act as the Rabies Control Authority. We investigate dangerous dog and serious bodily injury cases. We respond to injured companion animals and wildlife. We investigate neglect and tethering complaints in the city. We support our public safety partners. And we help mitigate wildlife concerns, which includes taking a lead role in implementing the city's coyote management policy. So, and we do all of that with 16 officers who are supported by 2 supervisors, 2 leads at a dispatch office, and a small outreach team. So we have almost 0% non-committed time in the field because we're responding to over 30,000 individual calls for service annually. And I share this because I want you to realize as we talk through our program development that we don't have a tremendous amount of personnel resources at our disposal, but we're able to accomplish a lot through some of the strategies that we're going to talk about. And oftentimes we only have 3 or 4 officers in the field at a given time.
Good evening. So in order to help you sort of understand how we got where we are, I'm going to take us back a few decades. The first semblance of an animal control program was first documented in about 1948, and it was when the city employed 2 dog wardens, and it was in direct response to a rabies outbreak, an acute rabies outbreak. Now, rabies, for those of you that aren't familiar with the virus, affects the central nervous system and brain and is nearly always fatal. Some of the symptoms often present as other common illnesses, so it'll present as a fever, maybe some discomfort, a headache, things like that. And then as the disease progresses, we see more specific symptoms. So we'll see things like insomnia, anxiety, hydrophobia, difficulty swallowing, and then ultimately death. Death typically occurs within a few days of when symptoms first begin. Now, rabies is endemic in the state of Texas, so that's a good fun fact to know. In the mid-1800s, that's when we first learned about rabies, or really when it was first documented in the state, and we learned about it through American folklore. Cowboys reported being bitten while they were sleeping by what they called phobie cats, which was a skunk, essentially. and they reported the difficulty they had in getting these skunks to release from their bite. And so it was documented through hearsay and then documented later, more formally. Now, moving forward a bit to like the 1940s, roundabout, veterinarians began recommending rabies vaccination in the dog population because up until then, the main vector for rabies in humans was dogs. And we knew that dogs were contracting rabies from the wildlife population. So the vet said, okay, smart thing to do here is to vaccinate our domestic pet population. But it wasn't required, it's just a recommendation. So the early 1940s, the vets started recommending the rabies vaccination, and some folks complied, and we started seeing a bit of a reduction in human rabies cases. In 1948, the state of Texas was, they suffered an acute rabies outbreak, and that was in the Fox variant rabies. That was an introduced variant in our state, and it spread very rapidly. At that time, the Austin, Travis, and Bastrop health units all worked together to introduce an anti-rabies campaign, which was a bit progressive for the time. They had two primary goals. Goal 1 was vaccinate dogs. Goal 2 was control the stray population. So out of that came 2 dog wardens in Austin, and during that year they collected 6,000 animals. And of those 6,000 animals, 28 tested positive for rabies here in Austin. In 1949, the state vet declared basically a rabies emergency. The outbreak had spread so fast and so far that there was quite a bit of concern about whether or not we were going to be able to get a handle on it and reduce the incidence of rabies spread to our domestic pet population. And again, if you remember, the domestic pet population is what was putting our human population at risk. So in 1952, most of the health authorities within the state of Texas got together and they all agreed that the best course of action, in addition to recommending rabies vaccination in dogs, was to also encourage citizens to reduce the wildlife population by 75% prior to the onset of winter. Reduce wildlife population, there's fewer to make babies in the spring, reduces our incidence of rabies. At least that was the thought process. So it kind of worked. All of that kind of worked. The state began to see a dramatic decrease in human rabies cases. So in 1935, we saw about 179 cases of human rabies, and by the early 1950s, we saw less than 10 a year. Pretty good decrease there. The state, however, continued to struggle with controlling the rabies outbreak in our wildlife population. And so when we have the rabies outbreak in the wildlife population, we get cross-contamination in our domestic species. So what the state said in 1979 is they went to the legislature and they said, okay, we need to mandate that rabies vaccinations occur in all domestic pets. So in 1979, the 66th legislature, they passed a law, affectionately known as the Rabies Control Act, that mandated rabies vaccination in dogs and cats. What that also did, that same act, it also mandated every region to assign a local rabies authority. And that is how we came to be. There we go. So the city of Austin originally was located, or the city of Austin Animal Shelter was originally located at 1156 West Cedar Chavez. Now, some of you probably already know that this shelter is still in existence, but it's now run by our partners, Austin Pets Alive. When the city of Austin was first at this facility, we partnered with the Austin Humane Society, and the Humane Society is who ran the adoption services, they ran some of the sheltering services, and the City of Austin was responsible for animal intake and impoundment. Now, at the same time, the Animal Control Unit, they were called Animal Control at that point, which still had their dog wardens, they were housed and they were a part of the health department. They weren't a part of the shelter, so our only role in the community was a collection of stray dogs to reduce rabies incidents and deliver pets. Probably didn't call them pets back then, probably just called them dogs. Deliver dogs to the animal shelter. And after that, we were done with it. And again, our only goal was to reduce the number of stray animals. So if an animal was running, we were picking it up. We weren't trying to run it home. We weren't trying to find its owner. We were picking it up to reduce the likelihood of that pet running into a rabid animal, and we were delivering it to the center. Now, eventually, the Austin Humane Society got a new facility up north. They're still operating. I'm not sure which way north is here. They're still operating here in Austin, also a partner of ours. And the City of Austin took over the facility down there at Town Lake. When that happened, in about the early 2000s, the Animal Control Unit then moved to the shelter and started taking a bit more active role in the activity and sort of business operations of the shelter.
Okay, so the animal welfare atmosphere in Austin in the early 2000s mirrors larger trends in the rest of the nation. As pets became more widely accepted as being parts of families, the general public's expectations changed around how it wanted municipalities to treat pets. As April described, animal control programs and facilities were originally about public health. They weren't about promoting animal welfare. And although this movement didn't create a no-kill Austin overnight, it did prompt the city to begin considering how it was handling companion animals and forced some steps in modernization. One of these steps was in 2006 to put forward a bond referendum that proposed the construction of a completely new, larger, more modern building that was truly meant to be an animal shelter, not just a pound. The proposal moved the shelter to a new location from its downtown Austin location to one on the east side of Austin onto the campus of Health and Human Services. Because as April mentioned, Animal Services at this point was still a division of the health department. The proposed shelter was meant to be more inviting and have a community center feel to it. It had lots of natural light. It was designed more to promote health and help make animals ready to move into a home environment. Fast forward a few years, in 2011, Austin City Council passed a 34-point no-kill plan, at a mandate that the city maintained at least a 90% live release rate. That 34-point plan was carefully considered. The criteria to be included in that plan was that everything had to have life-saving outcome or life-saving possibility for animals, and also had to be utilized successfully in other communities without the unintended consequences of increasing intake or increasing euthanasia. It's that plan that created many things, some of which you've heard today, such as the Shelter Neuter Return program. It included plans for offsite adoption programs and some other things. But what it did not include was much direction for animal control. You can also see at this time, in 2005, the city shelter was taking in over 22,000 pets. The yellow bar is euthanasia. So you can see that the majority of animals are not leaving the shelter alive. And about the time this no-kill plan happened, there's still about 25% of animals were being euthanized, and we still had over 20,000 animals entering the shelter. So the mandate forced a change in shelter operations almost overnight. There were suddenly a lot more animals with a greater variety of needs to address. And the center didn't have the best reputation or relationship with the community. As April mentioned, animal control was primarily just rounding up stray dogs, and those dogs weren't getting back home again. So then the question for animal protection became, what policies and practices needed to change to promote life-saving?
So the implementation of the no-kill plan really forced animal protection to reevaluate our processes, our current processes and practices. And as Leanne said, it did happen very quickly. It seemed like it happened overnight, I can tell you that from a personal standpoint. We knew two things for certain. We knew that, and again, this is from an animal protection standpoint, not necessarily the shelter as a whole, but from an animal protection standpoint, we knew two things. We knew that our calls were going to continue to come in, and we knew that punitive measures such as impoundment were no longer a viable option for resolving conflicts in the community. So we needed very quickly to ascertain this community's needs. We knew we needed to maintain public safety. We knew we needed to still focus on reducing incidents of rabies. We knew that we needed to support the animal shelter and the new mandates. So as a group, we began to realize that animals now were better off in their homes in the community than they were coming into our shelter, whereas before we tended to be a bit judgmental about some of the homes that these animals were living in, and maybe we felt, we'll take this dog to the shelter, maybe he'll have a chance at a better life because, maybe this house isn't as nice as we'd like it to be. So there was a shift in sort of this understanding about what a good home is. And we realized that pets, if they're in a home where they're loved and they're supported and they're cared for, then it's best to help the families keep that animal. And so with this new, we realized that our new role in the community really was to connect people to resources. And with that new role came a culture change. And so our team was comprised at the time of two very distinct types of officers. We had we called our old school traditional guys. So they believed in traditional animal control practices: pick up the dog, resolve the issue, write a citation, be done, get as many calls done as possible, tally up your impounds at the end of the month, and whoever had the most wins, that sort of thing. And then we had this other group of people who wanted to work to help the community, wanted to keep animals in their homes, and we sort of struggled a bit to balance those two groups. And eventually what happened is the folks that had this propensity to simply impound an animal or to quickly resolve an issue and move on, those folks eventually moved on out of our program. And we brought in new people, and we maintained and retained folks that were non-judgmental, that were sincere, that were focused on really delivering good service to the community and keeping pets in their homes. So a couple of things that we did in 2010 in particular, we introduced the notice of violation, which is essentially a warning ticket. And what that allowed us to do that we weren't allowed to do in the past was go to a residence where we might have a complaint call. We could cite the owner, so we officially put them on notice that we've recognized the violation. And then we could share information with them, get them connected to resources they needed, and give them a window, a time frame to get the issue resolved. And then we go back, it's resolved, citation goes away, animal's in better shape, and ideally, whatever brought us to the property in the first place becomes resolved. So we have a long-term resolution. What we found is the public began to build trust with the public, because instead of them expecting us to show up and impound their dog, they started seeing us as a resource. On loose animal calls, the other thing we started doing is if we collected a loose pet, we would stay in the neighborhood for a bit and try to locate somebody who could take on that pet. So we might leave the pet with a neighbor. We might, if the dog has a collar on it and it just has the vet tag, we might drive it to its vet clinic and drop it off at its vet clinic. We might call its owner and meet the owner at its work, go deliver their dog back to them. So we couldn't have to bring it to the shelter. We also equipped our officers with equipment to fix fences so that they could do minor fence repair. So some trucks were equipped with drills, some with miscellaneous tools like hammers and little screwdrivers, and some folks were equipped with fence stretchers, because we also handled loose livestock calls. So if we could get that animal back in its property, confirm that that is its property, we could repair the fence, at least temporarily, enough to keep him there until his owner gets back home. Of course, what this all did was it resulted in a lot more time and a lot more calls, right? So, as you can see on the screen here, we have experienced a pretty steady increase in calls received. The blue line there on the bottom is the service calls that we receive. So those are service calls from the general public. Those can be service calls from law enforcement agencies, from partner groups, what have you. And then the yellow line on top is all of the additional calls we actually respond to. So we get a call for service. Might be somebody's concerned that a dog doesn't have adequate fencing. Dog's getting out. We go to that location. We speak to the owner. They don't have adequate fencing. We get them connected with the fencing program. We follow up. That creates a second call, still related to that first call, which increases the calls we actually respond to. Does that make sense to everybody? I explained that right? So we've seen a call increase as a result of some of these, because of the transition and how we respond to our calls, but also in part to our population increase. Now, as Leanne mentioned earlier, we don't have unlimited staffing, and as a result, we had to sort of think about how we were going to best allocate the resources that we had, because obviously we can't go on forever extending the number or increasing the number of calls that we're responding to and increasing the time that we're spending at a residence to resolve an issue. So a couple of things that we did, actually more than a couple of things. One of the first things we did was we took 2 officers and we dedicated them to proper care calls and tethering calls. We knew that those calls required the most amount of follow-up, and we knew that those calls also required somebody to do a bit more footwork to get resources to a family in need. So we found that by dedicating 2 officers to those particular call types actually improved the efficiency of the program, and it shortened the time frame that it took for citizens, families in need to come into compliance. The other thing that we did is we took a look at some of our investigation processes. So our dangerous dog investigations, our vicious dog investigations, our rabies control or rabies investigations. We took a look at the process that we were currently following, and we looked at ways that we could streamline it. And what we realized is that, again, by dedicating certain individuals to dangerous and vicious investigations, and then also by automating part of the processes, we were able to reduce the amount of staff time that we spent on these investigations. And between dangerous investigations, vicious investigations, rabies investigations, improper care violations, that was really the bulk of of our time. That was the bulk of the follow-up calls. So as we streamlined those processes and automated some of those processes, we were able to sort of gain some staff time back, if you will. In 2014, after we got settled at the shelter and we were, we had been working on some of these new practices and processes for a bit, we started documenting these processes. So now it's not just something we do, it's an expectation of our staff. The other thing that we started doing here recently is we started looking at call data so that the decisions that we're making about the allocation of resources is more informed. So we look at call data, we look at demographics, and we look at trends. As an example, in the city of Austin, we have a zip code that's just a bit north of the shelter, and they have a very high stray animal intake number. And in relation to that intake number, they have a very, very low return to owner rate. And what we decided to do was go into that community and deliver microchips and tagging so that when our officers are in those locations and they pick up these loose dogs, because we know that we're not going to solve the loose dog problem overnight up there, that at least they'll be tagged now so we can get them home.
Thank you. No worries. Okay, so as April said, we really work to balance our enforcement responsibilities with engagement and the emphasis we place on promoting pet retention and quality care. And I think it's really important to remember that just because we're working to keep animals in their homes doesn't mean that we are turning a blind eye to true neglect cases or circumstances where animals should not remain with their owners. So one way to achieve that balance is to empower officers in the field to make decisions about what is needed to resolve a situation. So, and April touched on this briefly, but you really need the right people on your team in addition to having the right programs and tools for them to use. And if I had to choose between having the right people or large spay-neuter outreach budgets, I would choose having the right people on my team every time. So it's important that our officers are as committed to helping the people they're serving as much as they are to helping animals. Someone who professes to like animals more than they like people is not going to do well in this role. They have to be problem solvers, and they have to be willing to really examine the situation and get back to the root cause of the problem and not necessarily assume that what's ever presenting in front of them is the solution they need to solve. For example, if they're responding to a habitually stray dog, is that situation really going to be remedied by issuing another citation, or is it going to be remedied by fixing their broken gate? And officers have the ability to make the decision about which is appropriate. And arguably, fixing that broken gate is going to be a more efficient use of limited animal services resources anyway. And this, if we take that dog, or that dog is surrendered at the shelter, later, they're probably just going to get another dog and still won't have fixed their gate, and then we're going to have that dog running around stray. So the other thing to keep in mind about our animal protection program is that it's not a stepping stone to a law enforcement career. That might ultimately be where somebody's interests go, but anyone with an application who's citing an interest in law enforcement from the get-go tends to be suspect to me. First of all, it needs to be treated as a career in its own right, and even the desire to prosecute animal cruelty is a different sort of mindset than working to promote animal welfare and community health. Our officers have to be able to meet people where they are in an empathetic and non-judgmental way, as difficult as that might be. And that includes having to be able to redefine what neglect looks like, as well as what good pet owners look like. And sort of our litmus test is this person going to do better by the animal if they have a little bit of help, if they have a little bit of resources or more information? Is there going to be or is there going to be a change in that animal's living situation? If not, then that's a different conversation. We're also not educators. We're really just connecting people with information and resources. our goal really is to create allies in our community. So if we can help someone help their animal, then they're going to naturally help us sort of promote and strengthen our mission in their neighborhood. So we have had over time to sort of shift our thinking to thinking of our community as working with us and not against us, although that doesn't always feel that way. But you have to assume that people largely love their pets and they don't want bad things to happen to pets in shelters. Our key programs are our dog house and fencing program. The fencing program was originally started for dogs in the city of Austin when Austin passed a no tethering ordinance. So the fencing program was to prevent the unintended consequence of increasing intake at the shelter. So we have the ability to build people runs or finish off fences so the dog could be in the yard. That has the added benefit of helping integrate that dog more closely into that family and thereby reducing the likelihood of surrendering that dog later. We work with partners in the community to build dog houses, and so that enables us to provide people with ways to improve shelter for their animals if we have proper care complaints. And so these programs are primarily donation funded and are actually sustainable through our donation program. We also offer free leashes and tags, and so our officers have the ability to offer people those resources. The other major component of our program is a three-part spay-neuter program. So we try to connect spay-neuter resources with two audiences. One is the portion of the community that already wants spay-neuter services, if we could just remove the barrier to access for them. And then the second program, which is our SNOW program, or spay-neuter outreach, is for the portion of the population who doesn't know they're looking for spay-neuter resources. So we need two different strategies to connect people with spay-neuter. To address the first audience's need, the City of Austin partners with Emancipet, which is a low-cost veterinary services provider who has mobile capabilities. We sponsor around 30 clinics each quarter at 9 neighborhood locations, and we provide free spay-neuter, microchips, and rabies vaccines. Our officers all carry flyers and information about these programs to share with residents they're speaking with. These mobile clinics provide more accessible resource to people who are already looking by removing barriers such as locations. So maybe there are no clinics and veterinary service providers in some of these neighborhoods. It removes the financial barrier because we're offering free services. And it also, for people who just don't know where to look, we're able to then connect them. The locations were chosen based on the average income levels of the neighborhood, as well as the average intake in those zip codes, and the availability of other resources. We also hold twice annual rabies clinics and resource fairs. So this is a good tool to promote spay and neuter because people are coming already looking for rabies vaccines, and if you decide to get your pet spayed and neutered, you don't have to wait in line for the rabies vaccine. So that generally induces people to take advantage of that. And we service between 300 and 400 pets in about a 4-hour time period. For that second audience who isn't looking for spay and neuter, we have our spay and neuter outreach team, which is our public educators. So they work in the community primarily through referrals, and those generally come in through our animal protection officers. So that might be in response to a neglect complaint that didn't truly rise to the level of neglect, or a household that's frequently surrendering litters of puppies. So the SNOW team works with individuals to try to connect them with spay-neuter resources by building relationships. So it's really focused on engagement and trying to find out what pet owners need to provide better care for their pets, and not so much in preaching the benefits of spay-neuter, although that might be part of that conversation. And then they work to build that relationship. So they may make frequent visits to that site with the goal that over time someone is going to be more receptive to getting their pet spayed or neutered. And again, we'll address access barriers, so we'll drive pets to clinics and back home again if need be. The third spay neuter program that our animal protection officers support is our Community Cats program, which utilizes trap, neuter, return principles. At this point in animal welfare, it's accepted by many that the best place for community cats is there in the community where they are. And our program provides free spay, neuter, and vaccine resources to help stabilize that population. It's a partner program. We partner with the Humane Society, who provides the surgeries. The Animal Center provides most of the outreach, and then we're dependent on volunteers then to take our posted trapping jobs and work with citizens to get the cats trapped and then returned back to the community. And what I think makes Austin's program particularly unique is that in order to make the program as accessible as possible, because remember that's one of the themes we've been talking about is how can you connect people better with the resources they need, is that we serve as a drop-off location for those cats. So we're able to give a place for people to drop off cats who may not otherwise be able to fit the Humane Society appointment schedule into their day. So if they need to drop cats off on the way to work, they can drop them off in our climate-controlled mobile mini and then pick up cats at the end of the day on their way home. Through these programs, and again, we're heavily dependent on our animal protection officers to promote these in the community. We spay and neuter over 10,000 pets in our community, which never have to come through the shelter. And because our expectation is that every officers treat their contacts as an opportunity to share resources, they have the ability to make these referrals and connect with resources. And we've worked on joint spay-neuter messaging with our Emancipet partners, so everyone is sharing the same information. We also strive for a seamless approach to the delivery of animal services, so animal protection works closely with customer services on our return to owner efforts, so we can get as many dogs back home as possible. If customer service is unable to reach what we think is a known owner, animal protection will go out and try to talk with that person. If they're unable to make contact, they'll post notices, and if necessary, we'll drive those dogs home if transportation is the only barrier. April mentioned briefly that ideally the stray animals aren't going to come to the shelter in the first place. We'll return them in the field when possible. So our officers all have microchip scanners, in addition to knowing to check tags and to follow dogs home to see if they will go home on their own. But the added benefit of that isn't just that those animals don't need to come through our shelter. It gives us an ability to have a conversation with an owner that we might not otherwise have. Because remember I mentioned earlier that for some people this could be a 40-mile trip to the shelter, and that may not fit into their day. There's many people in our community that work multiple jobs, that don't work traditional schedules, and who may very much want their pet back, but just not know how to make that work. Animal protection actually only accounts for about 10% of our shelter's overall intake, and we actually return, I think, about a quarter of the animals we pick up in the field rather than bring them to the shelter. So with all of that, sounds like we have a robust program, and where are we going to go from there? And it is true that we've made some dramatic reductions in intake. You saw that bar chart earlier. Just 5 or 6 years ago, we had an average intake of over 25,000 animals, and we're remained steady at the past couple years for a little under 18,000, despite our unprecedented population growth. On average, we take in 1.5 animals per 100 residents, and the city has set a performance goal for us of taking in 2 animals per 100 residents. So all of that sounds great. But if you actually think about those numbers, there's a little bit of an incongruence there. And when you look more closely at a neighborhood level, there's areas in our community in which our intake is more than twice the average of the overall jurisdiction. So we're bringing in, 3, 4, 5 animals per 100 residents. and having a greater number of animal complaint calls. So what that says to me is that the traditional model, which largely is what we have a complaint-based animal protection program. It's not a proactive program. And we're really, even though we're out in the community the majority of our day, we're really only able to engage people as individuals and not as a community. So the traditional program that we have is obviously not working for everyone. The other item of note is that our intake is largely made up of what for the most part are animals that appear to have been owned at some point. So they're typically in generally good health. Some of them have collars, and that is over 70% of our dog intake. And we also know that once those animals make it to the shelter, over 2/3 don't go home again. So somewhere along the line, the bond between them and their families has been broken. And so what we need to do if we're going to move our program forward is to find out why that bond is being broken and act proactively to prevent that. So in the last year, we've merged animal protection and outreach to create our field services team. So that idea was that both of these teams are working in the community. They're both working to solve the same problems, and wouldn't it be great if we could coordinate better and perhaps leverage our resources? So that's an important organizational change we made. We also created the engagement manager position. And the goal of that position is to actually be out in those neighborhoods, finding out from the residents themselves what they need an animal services program to look like, which will begin in 2017. Currently what we're doing is we're completing community assessments. So we are taking a detailed look at populations within the zip code, and eventually we'll narrow this down to a neighborhood level. So we're working with our data analyst to narrow this down. But what we want to know is the total population of people. We want to know how many pets are estimated to be in that community, how that compares to our intake, what are our average income levels. We're looking at what pet resources already exist in the community, and we're also looking at natural partners. So be working with public health and our social services agencies to see what's already being done on a neighborhood level. And we all know this, generally where we see people-related problems, we see animal-related problems as well. So working together, we should be able to leverage our resources better. So what we anticipate seeing as sort of measures of success is we should see increasing return to owner rates, higher return in field rates, and declining intake and number of complaint calls to our 311 system. The second thing we've been doing is looking at, again, trying to address the number of stray animals that come in that don't go home to their families. We've been putting more emphasis on microchipping. Primarily our focus has been on spay-neuter, and that probably attributes to the pretty dramatic decrease in intake that we've seen the past few years. But since we've sort of plateaued, I think that we can reduce our intake, or at least our length of stay, if we can just get some of those animals back home again. So an example of how we're looking at some of our existing programs to place the emphasis more on return to owner rather than spay-neuter is that each year we do a July 4th campaign where we ask people to bring pets inside during fireworks to prevent them from escaping. But what do you think is wrong with that idea? These pets live outside all the other 364 days of the year. So someone seeing a poster that is letting them know that fireworks are going to be loud and potentially scaring their pet is probably not going to induce them to change the behavior. So we reworked our messaging to promote microchipping. We looked at what some of sort of the social gathering points were in those communities, and we did free tagging and collaring days, and we switched our messaging to promote how you find your lost pet. Comparing our animal protection intake data from this July 4th to last July 4th, we had fewer stray animals coming in, so I think that's encouraging. That's certainly not enough to say that there's a trend, but I think it's a pretty interesting correlation. And then finally, the last idea that I wanted to close with is that one of the pillars of no-kill animal sheltering is this idea that we actually have a large pool of adopters. So we're not necessarily looking to place animals in perfect homes anymore, because that keeps them in the shelter longer and turns people off to adopting, but we're looking to place them in homes that are good enough. And if we broaden that and extend that to the people in our community who are living with pets, it's sort of the same idea. There's already people who love their pets in the community who could be good enough homes if we could just, like I said, remove some of the barriers to resources. So doing that, we will broaden our impact and truly create no-kill communities.